Hello, and welcome to the Mik One podcast, where I sit down with industry leaders to discuss the project to product movement. I'm Mick Kirsten, founder and CEO of Tasktop and best-selling author of Project to Product, How to Survive and Thrive in the Age of Digital Disruption with the Flow Framework. Today, I'm very happy to be joined by David Anderson, Director of Technology at Liberty IT. David is a lifelong programmer that I've had the privilege of crossing paths with on occasion. I've admired how David connects his deep technical knowledge to business value. So when I heard the progress that David was making on deploying the cutting edge of serverless computing at Liberty Mutual, I realized I had to share his unique approach with our community. So with that, let's get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm here with David Anderson, and David was introduced to me by Adrian Cockcroft shortly after we were debriefing on that pretty amazing, to me, podcast that Adrian and I did a couple months ago. And what really fascinated me, if we reflect back briefly on the way that Adrian looks at cloud for CEOs, cloud for executives, and really making the case is it's not about reducing costs. It's not about infrastructure. It's really about optimizing and just dramatically shortening your feedback loop through flow. So really reducing flow time or time to value is the number one metric that people should be looking at. And as we were talking about this, Adrian introduced me to the work that David's been doing at Liberty Mutual IT. And it's absolutely fascinating because I think we've got an example here of exactly the right direction architecture to enable this kind of fast feedback loop, what Adrian called, to applying the theory of constraints to your OODA loop. So I've invited David here. David, I'd like you to introduce yourself in a second. And I really want you to listen for what you're going to hear as a both executive and technology message on how to actually move into the future of cloud and how to, most importantly, apply that to innovation to your business. So, David, welcome.
Thank you, Mick. Welcome. Great to be here.
And so before we get into some of the deeper concepts, tell us just a little bit about how Liberty technology is structured, how your organization fits into the overall company. And then I'd really like us to dig in to really understand how you so quickly got to this place of innovation and architecture that I think so many organizations are striving for. But tell us a bit about Liberty IT.
Well, Liberty Mutual, I think that Fortune 100 insurance company, where I think we're the fourth or fifth largest P&C insurance company in the world, and over 100 years old. Liberty IT, approximately 600-person organization based in Belfast and Dublin, and we're almost like an internal software house for Liberty Mutual. There's the broader technology organization, which we are part of, but kind of our remit within Liberty IT is really to progress technology and kind of engineering within Liberty Mutual, the enterprise. So we work with all parts of Liberty Mutual, and I've been at Liberty around 12 years.
Okay, great. And just to cut quickly to the chase here, what you've done within your organization is actually much more forward-looking in terms of cloud architecture than I'm used to seeing. Now, from a technology point of view, it makes sense. I think this is the future of how we're going to do cloud computing. But tell us a little bit about what's happened, because when a lot of organizations, a lot of executives are just trying to wrap their heads around, Kubernetes and containers, where you've ended up is actually somewhere quite different, and what I actually believe is significantly ahead of that. So tell us a bit about your journey and where you've ended up in terms of your thinking around serverless.
Yeah, absolutely. So I like to say it's our journey towards serverless first. And I think it was around 6 or 7, or maybe even 10 years ago, our CIO, James McLennan, we kind of kicked off 3 big initiatives: or move to public cloud, or become more customer centric, and our agile transformation. And we kind of did those 3 things at roughly the same time. And that set us off in a really good trajectory. And then as we started to move towards public cloud, we put in some really solid cloud native principles. And that really helped define, we worked with our finance, security, all our different parts of the organization. And we figured out what does a really good cloud stance look like for a large enterprise. And we figured out 6 years ago. And so we started that kind of infrastructure move, while doing that agile transformation and becoming extremely customer centric in how we think. So back around that time, myself and my team were kind of huge fans of Wardley mapping, and we started to see kind of Simon's work as he was working on it. We were kind of following along with him right back in the early days, maybe 2014 or so. And we started thinking, okay, when we reach the cloud, when we are agilely transformed, and when we're customer centric, what next? So we started to map out, how do we become innovative, How do we bring in speed, like fast feedback? How do we make sure we focus on the value? And how do we become like a learning organization? We don't want to stand still. So we started to wordly map out this kind of landscape of the cloud. And it kind of landed on serverless. We kind of thought that's the perfect direction for us to start thinking about. While the bigger organization is doing that kind of cloud infrastructure move, now we need to look at the application architecture move, which is the layer on top of it. So how are we going to behave when we're in this cloud native world? And that kind of led us towards the serverless first strategy that we're talking about today. Back then, we didn't really know what it was called. I think Lambda had just come out. We were just experimenting with Lambda. Lambda and S3 were kind of interesting, but this whole serverless first movement hadn't really started yet. So we were quite lucky that we kind of were able to see forward. And I'll thank Simon Wardley and his mapping technique for giving us the vision to see far forward.
Okay, so I want to unpack that just a little bit before we continue, because the thing I too commonly see, right, is that the move to cloud comes from a let's reduce costs, let's move off our data center, which results in lift and shift, which results in not much change and potentially higher costs, right, at least initially. What you've done is something different, which is become more customer-centric, create the Wardley map from that, and then that led you to a very different place in terms of your serverless architecture. And again, I think for our listeners, we'll define that soon if you're not familiar with it, but just a much more effective place in terms of flow and feedback to the business. So it's actually quite interesting to me, and I'm definitely a fan of Wardley mapping. Just tell our listeners a little bit about what Wardley mapping is and what this Wardley map looked like that brought you to, I think, a very unique place, and again, ahead of your peers.
There's kind of two axes. There's kind of the value chain, which is your kind of your gradual, if you start from the customer and work your way back from the kind of value chain, that's your kind of standard way of doing kind of value mapping. But then what Simon has done is put on this kind of movement, this evolution, where on the very left, it starts with Genesis, things that are brand new that no one has done. And then it's kind of like custom, that you figured it out, but you can't really repeat it. Then you're in the product, where you can actually repeat something, and then something becomes a commodity. When a component is commodity, it's not worth building it anymore. Just go and rent it somewhere. So what we started to do was we looked at how we would create value with the business in our kind of technology platform. So we started to look at things that were maybe custom or product and thought, well, if that's going to move, what happens next? What's the next piece in the value chain? Back around 6 years ago, we were focusing a lot on compute, but you could quite easily see that compute was going to become a commodity very quickly. So we kind of thought, okay, well, what then? And they say, well, is there a certain framework that will be the one framework to rule them all? I say, no, that's going to become commodity. So we as we worked our way up the value chain, you kind of go, well, what next? What next? And then so you can predict the movement, and you can also spot inertia. Is there potential blockers to that movement? Is there a technical decision we might make today that may prevent that movement? So once you can kind of see that piece of inertia, you can say, well, let's avoid that. And let's make sure when I'm in kind of, enterprise architecture type discussions, let's highlight that maybe that's not a good move because there's a potential inertia point. So I think with that far-reaching vision forward, you can kind of see. And I think was it like, the kind of soft ratings the world type movement, you just know the softwares are going to become faster and faster and faster. So it's quite obvious to us to keep a really clean kind of architectural stance on. And then one of the things that we thought that I think is really nice is Amazon talk about, no one-way doors. As you build your architecture, don't do things that will shut off things in the future. So always leave a two-way door that you can back away from things. You can maybe change your decision. So that was a really important way of thinking. So we try and bake flexibility into what we do.
Okay, excellent. And so I think it was the Wardley mapping that catalyzed your and the organization's thinking around value to the business, value to the market, which I think it's so great at doing. And interestingly got you to sort of a new point in the space, right? Because it actually led you, I think, further in the map to actually a serverless architecture where, like you said, very few people knew about anything other than Lambda back then. So if you could just define for us at a high level what serverless architecture is it just, I think a lot of people might be thinking it's just the nickname for the next type of implementing, but what really is serverless architecture? And tell us a little bit about your learnings and your journey with Lambda as well.
The thing that we started to notice is that when we have a foundation on strong engineering, and when we start to move engineers into the space, they almost naturally want to go fast. So any work that they're doing that doesn't seem valuable for our customer, they were starting to think, well, why do I need to do this? So we used the term undifferentiated heavy lifting. Like, why am I spending 2 or 3 days doing this thing it's invisible for my business. So we started to use the term undifferentiated heavy lifting, and how can we remove that? So things like provisioning a server, like you don't need to be doing that. Writing the configuration for a runtime, a workload, I mean, you don't need to spend days and days at that to maintaining that. So trying to kind of reduce those things that you shouldn't be doing. So as we see things like, S3, Lambda, and other kind of serverless services, can I just maybe, bind in something and use a bit of compute or use that service in a way that's almost event-driven? And I think event-driven is key, because the fact that you can have a very loosely coupled architecture where things can just event off each other, which gives you a huge amount of flexibility. So we started to come to the conclusion that serverless first, it's not about functions as a service. Okay, that's just the underlying compute model. It's not about even the cost model. It's about, the way it's the pay per use. It's not really about that. It's not about Lambda, definitely not. It's more about finding business value quickly. So what I started to notice that when we had teams writing with this kind of serverless first mindset, their first implementation choice is a serverless component. They weren't starting back at an on-prem Java framework and working their way up through all that evolution. Like, we've done that. So let's start at the end now and use a kind of service approach to kind of build our new technology. And if it doesn't work for some reason, we'll fall back to PaaS or a containerized solution. And that's fine, and that's perfectly acceptable. Or we have some great software running in containers and PaaS solutions. But let's start with serverless and fall back if required. So that means that we noticed that the engagement of the engineers was just skyrocketed. Everyone loves working in this environment. We noticed that people could actually produce software a lot quicker. And then the quality of that software is quite high, because you have some of the security considerations are better because you have less exposure. Some of the scalability is there. You get out of the box. So you start all these non-functional requirements. A lot of them are kind of taking care of you. Now, I wouldn't say it's faster. It's still very difficult, but engineers are really more effective and efficient with their time, which I thought was absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, exactly. I think this thing that you hit on, this undifferentiated heavy lifting, I think, as you know, with my journey, what I've been trying to do is help organizations find where their bottlenecks are, right? Basically apply the theory of constraints, as you've been doing. And I think in a fascinating way from first principles, identifying these bottlenecks, because what we so often see is that the sheer amount that developers spend on working on provisioning environments, configurations, and Kubernetes, and these things help. But if we actually dig into the areas where flow efficiency is most affected, where the bottlenecks are, so much of this goes into this heavy lifting. And I think what you realized so early on is that, and I think the phrase is perfect, I'm going to start using it now that you've said it, David, and I hope others will as well, is that it's undifferentiated heavy lifting. So if you're looking at it from the point of view of the customer, all of that configuration, all of that time is not going into something that measures value, which is why, of course, with the flow framework, these flow items, they only measure the flow of value. So instantly, all of that heavy lifting gets seen as something that's not adding to the flow of value, because you're doing it repeatedly every time you're trying to create a new application or bring something new to your customers, internal or external. And I love that strategy, right? Is that you start with the thing that's got the least undifferentiated heavy lifting. So it sounds very obvious when you say it, but can you just give us a little bit more summary on how innovation happens in this kind of environment, what you're providing to your developers, and contrast that with, I think, what you saw before, right? Because so many of our listeners are still trying to wrap their heads around what benefits will we get when we move from this, an on-prem Java applications to moving those into the cloud to containers. But really, I think, again, where you've ended up, shortcuts a big part of that journey, even though you've been very thoughtful around the parts of your portfolio, because like everyone else, you've got a large portfolio, falling back to containers or onto PaaS and potentially something still on-prem. So...
yeah, well, I think a lot of the controls we put in from our kind of, what I'd say our kind of centralized cloud teams, our resource tagging, our continuous deployment, our pipelines, our security controls, finance, etc. They will work for many different types of solutions in public cloud. So once you stand that up and you kind of get to that, that we bake those controls into the environment, then we almost went up a gear, because then we thought, well, now, if you switch around, we've got these controls baked into our environment, and there's one path to production. We do things like auto remediation. If something is tagged incorrectly, it's gone. It's zapped. So we're very hard on our runtimes. So then once you get to those controls, then you say, well, now how can we speed up our engineers? So we started talking about, and it's not really about reference architectures as such, like this is how you build something. I think reference architectures were interesting yesteryear, but now it's much more, I love the Lego analogy. Give me good Lego building blocks and then I can build something fantastic. And the more complex the building blocks, the faster I can build. So we started to look at templating patterns, architectural patterns, and that led us to CDK, the Cloud Development Kit, where we started creating quick patterns that developers could maybe generate an API within a couple of seconds, within a minute, and there's a production-ready hardened API, and then you, with all your correct taggings or your some well-architected features built in. So then you've got an accelerator where people can take these building blocks and start to build applications faster. But in order to get to a place where developers could do that, we've kind of got a system where we have a high level of engineering, which we encourage. We're quite team-centric about how that works. We encourage people to become experts in cloud, understand the cloud for its, read the white papers, actually get behind cloud and don't just use it as another kind of system. And then you can use these kind of enablers to go really fast. I would call these serverless first building blocks. And it just so happens that last year, AWS brought out CDK, which again is perfect. Before that, when we were using CloudFormation, it was a bit trickier because it was a bit, the syntax of CloudFormation is a bit more complex, but CDK has been an absolute game changer. But again, the point is those building blocks for developers, having expert developers design those is absolutely critical.
Okay, and so you're now at the point, actually, even further in the journey, of course, where you've got those Lego blocks, right? You've got these consumable services and development kits for developers. So that is just amazing. And can you tell us, how did you make this case, and how did the organization really support something that, again, at that point in time, when you started this journey years ago, and I think still at this point in time, this is extremely cutting edge, right? So whether there was perception of risk that we're trying to get ahead too high, too far away from what others are doing, how were you actually able to make this case to the organization? Of course, we heard what you said, which is the customer-centric mandate that brought you to cloud. I think really this is the underpinning of everything, because the thing I keep coming back to and hearing what you're saying, David, is organizations that have a cost-centric mandate of moving to cloud, I see them go sideways at best, right? Whereas this customer-centric mandate brought you to something that I think to others initially would seem so risky, which is let's bet on Lambda, on something very few of our peers are using at that point in time. But it's actually brought you to the place where I think the point you just made with this common set of controls, it actually sounds like you're managing even risk in delivery and in the pipeline better than others who might be stuck in older ways of doing things. So how did you make the case? And then, of course, get the ongoing support and investment within the organization, because you've pivoted and learned as you've gone along.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, for me, I think Liberty it's over 100-year-old company. We've always thought of technology as a differentiator. Like, it's not the IT department. Technology is a key part of how we drive our business forward. We think completely in a digital manner. That's just table stakes. But the thing I thought was really interesting is, like, we don't really sit down with our business partners and talk about, Lambda, provisional concurrency, step functions. That's not how you just say, well, what's the goal for this book of business? Is it fast throughput? Is it low cost? What do we need to do to improve the customer's experience? What's on your mind as a business partner? And when we start to get down that, maybe it's something, I need something to market quickly, something needs to be at low cost, we need to improve the experience. We find out, like, what's the actual business imperative behind the piece of work you're on. It's not just a project, we need to do A to B and we'll be done by Christmas. It's like, what are we trying to get out of this? So once your engineering team understand that, and they've got the skills to actually build that, plus all the product skills as well to do all the empathy, etc., the proper design, that whole package brings together. But then you want to be in a place where effectively you've got power tools in the hands of your engineers, and they understand what the business are after. I mean, the business don't ask us, can you make that secure and make it performant? You just know that you have to do those. But we had some early wins. Like, we had really solid cloud foundations, and then we had some really strong early wins. One story was about, I think it was 2016, 2017. We'd started experiment with natural language processing around kind of our call centers, and how do we bring in, kind of voice into, like, how do we bring the Alexa experience into some of our call centers? And we looked around, different options for doing that. And there was all these huge, some great vendors, but expensive and, long tails. We thought, we reckon we could build that ourselves with a serverless mindset. So we built a working prototype in 12 weeks that we put into production. So, we probably wouldn't have signed a contract with some vendors in 12 weeks. So we were able to in-house, we built a fully serverless chatbot in production in the call center that was able to speak with policyholders with natural language and have a conversation. And so what we did was we had a very small number of calls that it was kind of handling. We went through an awful lot of kind of really strong design principles to figure out what that should be like, and we tested the customer experience. And it was things like very simple queries. When will my rental car be ready? Next Tuesday. Okay, thanks. Stuff like that. So we put that to market in 12 weeks, production ready and hardened. And then we just scaled that. And now it hits, I think it takes something like 200,000 calls a month. And then when people say, wow, how did you do that? So, we use the service approach. So it's kind of like show, don't tell. When you get a piece of work that it's ready for this type of technology, then that's how you show it. You've built it quickly. It's performant. It's cost effective. It just ticks all the boxes. For me, that's cloud native, being able to be very innovative and responsive. And as well, the fact that you can turn things around really quickly. If someone asks for a feature, you can have it, in production in a matter of days, not months.
As you know, I couldn't agree more, right? That is the pattern of success that I'm seeing in terms of helping bring the organization to invest the right ways and empower the right people to create these modern cloud architectures, where it's, if you're demonstrating now something that was meaningful to part of the business, like this bot for the call center, and you're showing that this thing had a flow time that's measured in days, not what everyone's been seeing on the other parts of the portfolio, right? Weeks and months, and that's measurably there, providing value and then scaling up. It's amazing how infectious that becomes and how quickly it can bring the organization forward.
And there's tons of examples where we've done that. Like that was just one of the early ones that was quite significant. We're repeating that pattern time and time again. And even to something, we actually did something recently. We had a homeless organization in Dublin that spoke to one of our engineers, a guy called Landy O'Sullivan, and he was just doing a bit of kind of outreach work. And they said, we'd really like an app to do some certain things. And he kind of looked at it, and there was like budgets. There was no budget. So he built something really quickly in serverless that they were able to use as part of their kind of reach out to kind of homeless people in Dublin. So even building really quick applications that work, are hardened and low cost, it's absolutely incredible. But, and this is the most important thing, for anybody who's receiving this software, it doesn't sound like IT. It's a partner enabling their problem with technology. So that's just a game changer. There's no requirements documents, big lead-in times. It's like, what do you want? Boom, there you go. So it's that fast feedback. It's incredible.
That is an amazing story. And I think it's a heartening story, and how quickly those things can spread, and the value of, for the business, for the community, of being able to innovate so much faster. So this goes back to your approach with this, right? You didn't create the Kubernetes team and the Lambda team, the way that you even think about team structures. To me, of course, the most interesting thing is aligning product value streams. So the way that you can deliver value, such as, through that homeless application, through the structure of your software architecture, which you've aligned through cloud native and serverless, and through the team structure. So tell us that, because in the end, if the team structure is aligned to technology less than is aligned to business value, there's a mismatch. So tell us a bit about how you think about that angle of things, because again, I think it's getting all these three things right that really drives some incredibly fast results. So.
Yeah, I think, like I say, we're big fans of team topologies. I think the work Matt Skelton and Emmanuel Pa have done is fantastic. It's really helped our thinking. And we've always thought that the team is the unit of delivery. It's not a bunch of people, it's the team. So you look at that team, and do they have what they need, the expertise, the capability, etc. And I think, and then even that leadership within that team, are that team able to sit with their business partners and actually, figure out what is needed. I think for me, the interesting thing about the insurance industry is people think it sounds like it's quite, risk averse and, no one does anything. It's probably quite the opposite. We understand risk exceptionally well. And it's really about, if you've got that team aligned to business, it's really about how can we find the value? Like, how can we find something that's going to be a differentiator to build? And having the courage to say, okay, that's what's needed. Let's go ahead and invest and build that. Or we don't need that. Let's stop. So it's almost like, the courage to build and the courage to stop. One of the things I find fascinating about serverless, and it's something I'll take on a slight tangent. It's a mindset we started to get into the teams, is code is a liability.
Mm-hmm.
We're all like, I've been writing code since I was probably 8. Do you know what I mean? I love writing code, but you have teams of builders and they want to build. So you say, well, but when you turn up to work, your job is not to build. Your job is to help your partner achieve their business need. And sometimes that is not writing software. It's whatever that is. So getting that aspect, that understanding code is a liability. And this I think this is really strong for our business partners. It's not an asset. When you write a piece of code, that's not an asset you need to protect. It's a liability. And the more you have of it, the greater the risk, the security risk, maintenance risk, deprecation, etc. So less code, the better. It's the system that's the asset. So spend time getting the system right and try and do as little code as possible. And that's the thing that's been a real kind of game changer. So as we start, and I mean, you can think of Lambda as kind of glue. You're just tying things together, So it's a different way to think about building technology. So getting that code as a liability mindset into the teams has been really important, because sometimes, a business partner will say, I've seen something, we need to build X. And you need to say, well, yes, that's a good idea. And if we understood the business problem fully, we could maybe have a few alternatives where we don't have to build something. So I think getting the teams in the right mindset to create value, I think, has been really, really important. And one thing the team Topologies has given to our teams is getting the team to focus on either a value stream, a complex value stream, enablement, helping others, or even platform. Because we do have some teams building platforms, but they need to understand that's their primary focus. It's what's always a red flag for me when a team say, yeah, we've got a value stream and we're helping these guys and we're also building a platform. I think, okay, well, that's not good.
Yeah, exactly. For anyone who might not have heard it, in terms of, I think I'm a big fan of team topologies. We did an earlier project podcast with them, because in the end, these topologies are the patterns that will actually allow you to understand how to align your teams to value streams and different options that you've got. So it's a great thing to look into. And I think it is one of these principles, David, that you're reflecting here, right? And so let's just talk, you mentioned undifferentiated heavy lifting, right? And I think that applies regardless of what your architecture is today. You need to be looking for the undifferentiated heavy lifting that's not contributing to your flow in any way, right? Or your feedback cycle. It's actually impeding it. And the point on code as a liability, again, my view is that applies universally. So like you, I'm a fan of event-based architectures. Our core products have shifted to those, but we still have some legacy that's not event-based. And the thing we celebrated last week in my company is how much code was removed from an very much older product line, because now we've got less liability there, right? And I think sometimes we do overfixate on just it's always around technical debt reduction, but really elevating technical debt reduction, that whole point of the flow framework is to allow you to invest in removing that liability. And I actually do see the same thing as you, right? Organizations that actively remove code, actively remove liability, are able to move complex portfolios ahead much faster.
Yeah. And I think that the flow framework is fantastic for actually visualizing some of these things, and you can see the different kind of impacts that are kind of hidden. Because, as you talk about technical debt, there's also business debt. Because I think sometimes if you've been in a certain line of business for maybe, 10, 20, 30 years, it will grow extra complexity. So I think something like the flow framework gives that visibility into how you're kind of how things are kind of playing out, and then you can actually identify either the technical debt or even business debt, which gives you a great indication of what to go for next.
Yeah, I'm glad you make that point. I think the goal of the flow framework is just to actually allow executives, other parts of the organization, very different parts of the technology organization, to see the dynamics that you see, right? To see the dynamics that you're reflecting and that you were actually able to steer your organization through by actually understanding these trade-offs, right? It has been amazing for me to see as I've been looking at more and more of these, where the biggest constraints are. Because in the end, I think this is truly about what Adrian Cockcroft said on the podcast, which is applying the theory of constraints to your observe, orient, decide, and act loop, your OODA loop, right? So you've been doing that all along. I've been trying to make those constraints more visible, because there are these different, it basically, theory of constraints is a whack-a-mole, right? Where you'll actually address some of the technical debt constraint, you address some of the architecture constraint, and then you'll be, what will be staring you in the face is the business debt. So I'm, so glad you bring that up, because in the end, if some of those things aren't addressed, they're actually the root or the source of different aspects of that the teams are dealing with themselves, right? If they're still stuck customizing this particular application for 8 different regions, rather than moving to a common platform or making things like search a common platform that the regions consume, a common service, you might not be able to unlock that without actually addressing the business debt. So easier said than done. How do you, how have you been approaching the business debt side of it?
Again, it's partnership. I mean, I think, you can't be thinking like the IT team and the business team. You've one team and you've one business imperative. And if whatever your goal is, I think you just need to look at that. Again, I think it takes courage and leadership from everyone in that team, and usually you're sitting with an individual who is effectively that business owner of that book of business or that business problem. And you want to really get behind, like what's their short-term, long-term goals? Where do they need to take? And sometimes, there's a simplification effort in that kind of business process. Sometimes it's you reimagine it with innovation. Other times there's a kind of like a refactoring effort to kind of tidy up some downstream technical debt. You don't really know, but I think that the first point of that is sit down with that kind of a business owner. And I'm not using the word stakeholder there. I think that's important. A business owner, whoever is kind of owning that piece of business and saying, well, let's sit down as a team and figure out what are our options for doing next. So I think it's that honesty, courage, and kind of leadership to sit down and look at that right across the board. And I think as well, I mean, you talk about in the flow frameworks, you have different flows. I mean, the phrase we tend to use is journeys. We look at the different journeys within our enterprise and to say, how can we make this more efficient or effective? And I think you need to have that kind of holistic viewpoint of it. Because again, I mean, it's not just the software, there's a bunch of stuff, but I think it starts with that conversation about, okay, what's the business imperative here? And then you work your way back from that.
Yeah, exactly. David, you said so well, as you sit down, it's one team. And then, as you said previously, you say, what's the goal, right? Is our goal reducing cost? Is our goal moving to market faster? Is our goal more of an innovation? Is our goal getting more conversions? And this is a goal that's set for the value stream, for the teams, and a common goal that you march to. And I think, again, the power of having that single goal, which, by the way, is something that evolves over time, right? I've heard you talk about evolutionary architecture. Today the goal might be, quickly innovating more features to market, but then, of course, the technical debt might increase, or your cloud costs might increase to the point where you actually now have to do some refactoring, re-architecture to get to that common goal of continuing to deliver value to the customer. So I think your guidance on actually, again, making this, in the end, it's making these trade-offs visible to the business owner, I think is what you're guiding others to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think when the individuals in the technology team understand the kind of business domain, maybe you'll know, well, okay, we're going to see a spike in traffic in 6 months' time, and we understand that there's things we need to do ahead of time. Maybe there's some change coming up that, I think we're getting away from it now. I mean, and you touch on it very well in Project the Products. You can't have the attitude, we'll not do that unless we get a requirement. I mean, that doesn't work today. You've got to think ahead and understand. You've got to look ahead. I think in insurance, there's certain things that we see are going to happen. There's different patterns year on year, but there's other things that are completely unexpected. So I think you need to be very flexible in how you need to effectively, number one, you serve your customers first. That's number one priority. So what potentially could happen and you don't want your systems to basically fall short in a time of need. So I think and you can't sit and play the contract game. Well, you didn't tell us we had maybe hit 1 million users in a day. You can't play that game. I think you have to you have to look ahead and be preemptive and think what could potentially happen that I need to bake into the system. So I'm a big believer in the technology team understanding the business domain and figuring out what does this system need to do based on what we know may happen. Excellent.
And so, David, I think that we're at time right now, but I want to make sure that for our listeners, some of what you've done, and actually the technology parts of the journey, I think the amazing thing has been the way that you and the organizations have leaned into these new technologies and the results that you've seen. I actually do think it's important to understand and keep up with some of those key technology movements, right? Because that's what you've put in place, and you were actually able to, after understanding how this would meet the needs of the customer, where you end up on that orderly map, select the right set of technologies and the architectures that supported the flow and feedback needs of the business. So I hear that you're launching a blog where you're actually going to talk about some of those key technology practices. So if you could just tell us about that, because again, I encourage everyone to check it out and understand where these technologies are going because of how powerful they can be of accelerating this flow and feedback loop.
Yeah, well, we've got a blog out called the serverless-edge.com. The serverless edge is more about being on the edge of technology. What's the cutting edge of technology? And it's not really the latest version of a framework or component. It's what is the edge of the future of work, the edge of technology, the kind of that future-facing technology. And it's really, there's different business models that are currently evolving. There's different ways that we handle our technology. I think some companies understand it, but it's not well understood. I think a lot of people, when you mention serverless, they'll say, yeah, Lambda. It'll turn into a Lambda versus container argument, which is exactly not what it is. So it's you got to elevate yourself above the technology and think about, if I'm on the edge of technology, what does that mean? What does my company need to feel like? How do we need to lead? Or how do we set ourselves up for success? What are the things we need to think about? I think there's a mindset, if you're going to be on that kind of serverless edge, that's really important to understand. And I think it's quite difficult to unpick that from a lot of the press and news you see coming around. I think sometimes you need at least people to give you a bit of narrative or a bit of commentary about different things that are happening. Because, once you get into the cloud providers and see a lot of the technologies, it gets confusing very quickly. So what we're trying to do with the serverless edge is basically to put a commentary on that and you don't need to be a developer to read it. We're trying to reach a broader audience. There is a different way of working. It actually sits very well with the future of work as well, because there's a much different way of working. And I think it's going to be a game changer for some companies. It's almost like what I'd call, it's the next level of cloud, whatever that's called.
Yeah.
I don't think serverless is a great name, but hey, it's what we've got.
Well, it gets across, some of the key concepts, right, in terms of getting rid of that undifferentiated heavy lifting, which I think you and I in our entire careers have felt what that's like, and want everyone to feel a whole lot less of it and deliver more to customers. So yeah.
I'm telling a story as well about how to enable a serverless cloud center of excellence at reInvent this year as well, 2020. So that'll be a talk to look out for as well. Myself and Jessica Fang are giving that talk, which is a bit more detail about how to enable that serverless cloud center of excellence.
Excellent. Well, David, any amazing insights? I really look forward to following the Serverless Edge as well, and I encourage others to do so too. So it's great to have this out there. Again, this combination of technology and very forward-looking but very actionable architecture. And really, as you said, I completely agree, the next step of cloud, but the next step of cloud that you should be thinking about now, and you should maybe just jumping straight into, as I think you've made clear through some of your successes. So any final thoughts to leave the audience with?
I think it's worth looking forward. I do. Something like Worldly Map, and I think it's a difficult technique, but I couldn't abdicate enough for actually sitting down with some leaders in your organization and kind of casting your mind forward. Because I think there's a huge amount of change happening at the minute, and I think there's repercussions into your own organization, into your market, into your technology landscape. So I think actually sitting down and thinking ahead of where do we need to be, and actually discovering the shape of that, and how you think technology and your business landscape may evolve, and kind of being ready for that. I think there's an awful lot of challenging frameworks around business strategy, but I'd be a huge advocate of Worldly Mapping because it's a fantastic way to actually see into the future. So I would definitely have a look at that.
Okay, excellent. And my one recommendation on that is to bring your leading technologists into that discussion, because if you're doing it without that kind of deep technological insight, I've seen this Worldly Maps end up in slightly different places than they should. So, but clearly what you've done is absolutely leading. So thank you so much, David. And we'll check out the serverlessedge.com.
Thanks, Mik. Really appreciate the time. Great chat.
A huge thank you to David for joining me on this episode. For more, follow me in my journey on LinkedIn, Twitter, or using the hashtags Mik+1 or Project to Product. You can reach out to David on LinkedIn or his Twitter, which is @DavidAnd393. I have a new episode every 2 weeks, so hit subscribe to join us again. You can also search for Project to Product to get the book. And remember that all author proceeds go to supporting women and minorities in technology. Thanks, stay safe, and until next time.